The clue is that during this period of time, to be more precise in 1993, the global enemy of democracy activated its ideological center of the anti-cult movement, which has been located in Russia since that moment to this day. It is exactly from there that commands are given from, and a single ideological vector is set for the entire anti-cult movement worldwide, extending to its entire network. Now, using the example of this ideological center, let's discuss in detail how it operates in the country that it has turned into a testing ground for practicing its methods, which it plans to transfer and apply throughout the world in the near future.
Ideological center of anti-cult groups. The ideological center of the entire transnational network of contemporary anti-cult movement, and the chief developer of its propaganda methods, is the Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects, abbreviated as RATSERS. The basis of RATSERS is the Center for Religious Studies in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus of Lyon, established in 1993. This center was founded by the anti-cultist Alexander Dvorkin with the blessing of the then Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Alexei II. RATSERS representatives cover their activities under the guise of an allegedly noble mission of defending the interests of the country's titular religion, namely Orthodox Christianity. However, the real situation is far more complicated. Within the religion itself, there are individuals who, while outwardly adhering to orthodoxy, actually support anti-cult movements. These individuals act in unison, pursuing their own goals and benefits, which have nothing to do with religion itself. Therefore, it's crucial to distinguish between religion as a system of values and beliefs, and those who have infiltrated it with malicious intent to use it as a cover for their destructive activities. These anti-cult operatives and their allies within the Russian Orthodox Church have turned this country into a staging ground for their activities and launched a targeted terrorist attack on democratic countries from there. The radical ideology of RATSERS, which originated in Russia, now extends its influence far beyond its borders. Anti-cult organizations hold particularly strong positions in China, France, and Germany, where they have secured significant support from authorities or individual representatives. This support allows them to exert influence over legislative, judicial, and law enforcement bodies. One of the prominent representatives of this international terrorist network is the European Federation of Centers for Research and Information on Sectarianism, FECRIS, headquartered in Paris. France, a country with a long tradition of democracy, has unexpectedly become part of the criminal anti-cult movement scheme, with 90% of FECRIS's activities funded by the state budget. Additionally, anti-cult activities are institutionalized in France through the Interministerial Commission Miviludes. However, the actions of this commission, as well as those of FECRIS, have repeatedly faced criticism from the international community, including for employing violent deprogramming methods, forcing individuals to renounce their beliefs through literal tortures, against members of various religious groups. Both FECRIS and RATSERS comprise a number of organizations. The FECRIS and RATSERS networks are closely interconnected. They operate under a unified policy, use identical methods, and maintain close relationships. For instance, Alexander Dvorkin, president of RATSERS and Russia's leading anti-cultist, also served as vice president of FECRIS and still remains a member of its board of directors. Additionally, RATSERS vice president and Dvorkin's associate, Orthodox archpriest Alexander Novopashin, is also a corresponding member of FECRIS. Currently, the participation of RATSERS representatives within FECRIS has been officially suspended. This was done to conceal the influence of Russian participants on FECRIS's ideology and to avoid accusations of active support for Russian propaganda against Ukraine during the escalation of the military conflict between these two countries. Despite their official charters, claiming adherence to international conventions on human rights and freedoms, the reality is that anti-cult organizations operate in a starkly different manner. Since their inception, These anti-cult organizations have repeatedly discredited themselves through anti-democratic and unlawful activities, which include the deliberate spread of lies and slander, intentional incitement of violence, the use of destructive manipulative techniques, the instigation of conflicts fueled by interreligious hatred, and the targeted persecution of dissenting groups, sometimes even leading to physical assaults. Officially, the anti-cult umbrella organization FECRIS includes groups based in Europe, while Ratseers encompasses organizations in Russia and the CIS countries. Both associations actively collaborate with anti-cultists from the United States. American anti-cultist Steven Hessen has attended conferences organized by FECRIS. Hessen was also a guest lecturer at one of educational clubs in Russia, where the anti-cultist Alexander Dvorkin is a regular lecturer too. Moreover, Hessen has repeatedly traveled to Russia with his lectures at the invitation of Russian anti-cultists. Dvorkin published a book titled 10 Questions to an Obtrusive Stranger, which entirely mirrored a chapter from Hessen's book. Moreover, Dvorkin actively recommends Hessen's books, and their rhetoric about the dangers of cults is identical, often echoing each other word for word. This synchronization of narratives indicates regular information exchange and collaboration, suggesting a direct and close relationship between Hessen and Dvorkin. A closer examination reveals the influence of the anti-cult ideological center on both social and political processes in the United States. This will be discussed in more detail later. Another fact pointing to the influence of the anti-cult ideological center on the U.S. is that in the 1990s, American newspapers, including prestigious outlets like the New York Times, suddenly began actively quoting Alexander Dvorkin and his subjective assessments of so-called cults, not only in Russia, but in other countries as well. Doesn't it seem odd that the comments of a Russian cult expert suddenly appear in such well-known newspapers as the New York Times? It's noteworthy that the views and comments of a relatively unknown Russian cult expert were featured in the New York Times. Despite the usual difficulty of achieving such exposure, even for top-level experts. This could be the result of financial investments, or bribery of the media, or even the presence of certain influence agents within the media. Regardless, this indicates the existence of a coordinated force to integrate the opinions of Russian extremist anti-cultists into American publications. Now, using the activities of the umbrella organizations FECRIS and Ratseers and their leaders as examples, let's examine the criminal methods of their operation, which might qualify the activities of anti-cult organizations as terrorist acts. How do anti-cult organizations operate, and what is their role in executing the enemy's global plan to destroy democracy?
In the flood of news, many of you have come across terms like destructive cults, totalitarian sects, or even killer cults.
Dangerous and abusive cult.
Totalitarian cults.
Cults. The word cult.
The cult. Cult.
Shocking cults.
Representatives of anti-cult organizations label selected groups without relying on factual evidence, police investigations, or thorough complex theological analysis. Instead, they follow entirely different playbooks, which have no relation to theoretical science or even to objective reality.
While the term cult is a key stigmatizing term in the United States, in Europe and the post-Soviet countries, this role is played by the term sect, especially totalitarian sect, which also carries a strong derogatory and stigmatizing connotation. Since 1993, anti-cult movement ideologue Alexander Dvorkin has widely introduced the term totalitarian sect into post-Soviet media. The term totalitarian, borrowed from political science and propaganda language of the Cold War era, evokes associations with oppression, camps, imprisonment, barbed wire, forced labor, and meager food. Thus, this term is used to incite fear, anxiety, and a biased attitude toward the members of organizations labeled as totalitarian sects. The vagueness of the terms totalitarian sect and destructive cult allows anti-cultists to baselessly categorize any organization under these labels.
However, the use of terms such as sect, cult, totalitarian sect, and destructive cult is not supported by the laws of most countries or international legal documents. These terms lack legal justification, and their use contradicts the legislation on freedom of conscience and religious associations. Nonetheless, anti-cultists continue to use these terms as weapons of accusation and incite the media to use them.
The illegal activities of the anti-cult movement do not go unnoticed both internationally and within Russia, where representatives of academic and legal circles highlight the fraudulent and criminal nature of anti-cult organizations in general, and their chief ideologue, Alexander Dvorkin, in particular. Alexander Dvorkin's activities are also condemned in the United States, where a legal assessment of him was provided in a special report for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, USCIRF. The main responsibilities of this commission include reviewing the facts and circumstances of universal religious freedom violations and making policy recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and Congress. Here are some findings and recommendations provided by Jason Morton, a policy analyst for the USCIRF, in a report titled "The Anti-Cult Movement and Religious Regulation in Russia and the Former Soviet Union." Dvorkin has long provided the anti-cult movement with a veneer of intellectual credibility. Alexander Dvorkin and his associates have carved out influential roles in government and society, shaping the public discourse on religion across numerous countries. Claiming to be experts in academic fields like religious studies, psychology, and sociology, they are rarely qualified in any of them, and often rely on discredited theories and methodologies to promote their ideological agenda. The anti-cult movement is fundamentally a propaganda outlet, conducting a highly effective information war against religious minorities throughout Russia and many of the countries in which it retains influence. The U.S. government should publicly censure Alexander Dvorkin and the St. Irenaeus of Leon Information Consultation Center, SILIC, for their ongoing disinformation campaign against religious minorities. Counter propaganda against new religious movements by the European Federation of Research and Information Centers on Sectarianism, FECRIS, at the annual OSCE Human Dimensions Conference, with information about the ongoing involvement of individuals and entities within the anti-cult movement in the suppression of religious freedom.
Thus, representatives of the anti-cult movement do not hold a scientific position or have research motives, although they often disguise themselves as such. In reality, they intentionally introduce the concepts of destructive cults and totalitarian sects into the information space, using them to incite hatred and religious intolerance in society. The criteria and accusations they use to classify certain organizations as cults and sects are not recognized both in academic circles and within the legal framework. Attaching a harshly negative label is the first step in a systematic scheme of conducting information terrorist attacks. The goal is to transform followers of peaceful organizations and law-abiding citizens into objects of hatred and hostility without any factual basis.
Dehumanization. The process of dehumanization is the first step in the actions of anti-cult organizations aimed at eliminating those they find undesirable. This method is used to push the victim out of the social field, making them highly vulnerable. After all, if a group of people or an individual is labeled a cultist or cult member, the victim immediately loses his or her human image. This stigmatization creates the conditions for further violations of human rights and freedoms. Dehumanization serves to justify future crimes, dull the conscience and critical perception among the population. Dehumanization is the processing of society to accept and participate in future crimes. Presently, anti-cult terrorists have managed to implant the following mindset in the masses. Cultist equals non-human. To achieve their goals, representatives of anti-cult organizations utilize the media, propaganda, the dominant religion in their country, law enforcement agencies, and even governmental structures.
Totalitarian sects are dangerous. They pose a significant social threat.
When most people use the word cult to define a group, they mean a destructive cult. Cults that hurt people through abuse. This could be physical, mental, emotional, sexual, or financial exploitation. Often deceptive, coercive, abusive, and relentlessly authoritarian.
A myriad of different types of mind control cults. There are religious cults and therapy cults and business cults and political cults, cults of personality with a...
Any cultic structure always fights against society, demonizing and speaking negatively about it, which is natural. And studying the history of any given cult organization, we understand the serious threat they pose on a personal level, at the family level, societal level, and even at the national security level. The goal of any cult is power and money.
Each totalitarian sect that is a cult has global plans. Each totalitarian sect strives for power and control over the world and over everyone. That's what makes them cults. They may temporarily cooperate with each other as long as they have a common enemy. And this common enemy for them is primarily orthodoxy.
Right now, while you were listening, some of you might have had thoughts in the background like, what's wrong with what the anti-cultists are saying? Cults are indeed dangerous. And all cult members are brainwashed, foolish, or deceived people. You might be surprised when I tell you that these thoughts are not your own personal convictions. These thoughts are actually the result of the anti-cultists' efforts to artificially implant these destructive images into your subconscious through the information field. Many of you, when hearing the words cult or sect, recall real examples of dangerous cults you have heard about in the media, whose activities have caused harm to people and society. The term cult is associated with personal danger, images of mass suicides, women who have been victims of sexual exploitation, the erratic behavior of cult leaders bordering on psychopathy, and zombified followers who unquestioningly give all their money and property to their leader. However, think about how long ago did you meet such things in real life, and what is your knowledge of new religious movements, aside from the negative images spread by anti-cultists? Of course, it must be acknowledged that among the founders of new religious movements, there are individuals engaged in fraud and deliberately exploiting the trust of citizens for personal gain, including committing illegal acts and crimes. But how can representatives of anti-cult organizations help in this situation? These cases should be handled by law enforcement agencies, since they bear the main responsibility for protecting citizens from such threats. In such cases, they must conduct the necessary investigation, collect evidence of illegal activity, and only after that should all perpetrators be prosecuted according to the law and the criminal organization be terminated. However, when it comes to anti-cultists, everything happens in reverse order. First, they make baseless accusations and attach labels comparable to accusations of committing grave crimes, and only then do they seek the involvement of law enforcement agencies and the initiation of criminal cases. However, the majority of such cases are based not on facts or results of objective investigation, but on rumors, slander, false testimonies, and labels affixed by anti-cultists. This particular characteristic of the strategy employed by all anti-cult organizations reveals their actual goals and intentions. They do not aim for an objective analysis of religious organizations to identify potentially dangerous ones. Instead, they are focused on discrediting and shutting down any groups they choose as targets. They achieve this by violating basic rights and freedoms, employing a range of manipulative methods, smear rhetoric, and hate speech. Because their true goal is not the stigmatized groups they've discredited and persecuted, but the entire society that will be watching this public execution. Their goal is to carry out acts of information terrorism aimed at undermining society, destabilizing the situation in the country, and ultimately destroying democracy.
One of the tactics used by anti-cultists is to justify the unwarranted persecution of modern religious organizations by citing historical examples where certain extremist groups, labeled as cults, committed real crimes. From these isolated cases, a false conclusion is drawn about the danger of all new religious movements without exception, regardless of their origin, goals, or values. The method of guilt by association is a manipulative tactic where the targeted organization is intentionally linked or associated with negative images of extremist groups, terrorist organizations, criminals, and dictators who are already viewed negatively by the public. This tactic is further amplified by a deliberate distortion of fragments of the target organization's teachings, taken out of context, which contributes to the demonization of the group's image. As a result, an aura of danger is deliberately created around the undesirable organizations and their members, accusing them of crimes despite the lack of direct evidence of any harmful activities. Such actions by representatives of anti-cult organizations denote a complete violation of the presumption of innocence, as proclaimed by Article 11 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that every person has the inherent right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty according to law. Violating the presumption of innocence is an illegal act aimed at spreading intentional slander and misleading the public. Mass media are accomplices of anti-cult terrorists. Mass media play a crucial role in dehumanization and targeted persecution of religious and secular organizations chosen by anti-cultists as their victims. By leveraging their unofficial contacts among media representatives, including journalists, editors, and leaders of major publications, anti-cultists initiate and carry out large-scale and prolonged campaigns to discredit these targeted organizations. In essence, they orchestrate information terrorism.
Therefore, the cult works ahead of the curve.
How do cultist fraudsters turn people into slaves? And how have they managed to evade responsibility for decades? How Jehovah's Witnesses embarked on the path of extremism.
As part of these campaigns, various methods of negative influence are employed, including the use of aggressive rhetoric, hate speech, dissemination of false information, slander, provocations, and incitement to aggression against targeted individuals. In this process, unscrupulous media representatives are recruited into this network of cooperation, willing to engage in dubious actions to achieve their goals, meaning committing information terrorism. Thus, anti-cult organization representatives recruit the direct perpetrators of future attacks. Additionally, anti-cultists create the image of victims from some of the recruited or interested individuals who have allegedly suffered from the malevolent influence of the stigmatized organization. The stories of these pseudo-victims are widely disseminated in defamatory media publications, despite many of these tales being intentional lies.
All this inevitably leads to crime, which in fact exists in the vast majority of cults, or potentially exists in one way or another. Violations of the law begin. At first a few, then more, and then it's more often, and these are obvious crimes, and they absolutely violate all moral norms.
This is how anti-cultists label a targeted group as dangerous and manipulative, though in reality, it is their own actions that are dangerous and manipulative. Through their people in the media, they conduct genuine psychological processing of society. This, in turn, allows them to manipulate the aggressive sentiments of the public, the sentiments that they themselves have provoked. They implant explicit narratives in people's subconscious that all the organizations they label are cults and are dangerous, and that cult members are non-humans. This simple formula plays on the basic instincts of every person, evoking fear for their own lives and the lives of their children, creating an image of a constantly looming threat. Naturally, the reaction to this stimulus is self-defense, with only two options: fight or flight. since anti-cultists accompany their propaganda with incitement to hatred and encouragement of unlawful acts. The dominant response becomes fight or even destroy. Under this scheme, anti-cultists can dehumanize and demonize any organization they consider undesirable, pushing it outside the bounds of the social field. When you hear the word dehumanization, it might seem abstract to you. If so, I invite you to listen to the stories of the outcomes of its practice on the specific example.
Alexander Dworkin's anti-cult terrorist activities. For many years, Ratsir's representatives have been spreading hostile statements towards numerous new religious movements. Their meetings, interviews, lectures, and public activities have created a hostile atmosphere in society, often leading to subsequent manifestations of hatred and xenophobia among the population. For instance, the ringleader of the anti-cult group in Russia, radical ideologist Alexander Dworkin, has waged an active disinformation campaign against the Christian movement of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia since the beginning of his anti-cult career in 1993. Dworkin used all forms of propaganda against the followers of this organization, from defamatory articles in newspapers, magazines, and internet portals, to media appearances where he gave highly negative assessments of this religious group, accusing and portraying their activities in the worst possible light.
The Jehovah's Witnesses came to an Orthodox Christian country. They insult me and my faith, and in this sense, I have the right to respond to them. My book is a response to their persistent molestation and their relentless recruitment. These Jehovah's Witnesses manipulate the minds of their members, but they also make enormous amounts of money. Usually, when Jehovah's Witnesses speak, they certainly squeeze out everything they can. Jehovah's Witnesses, by definition, cannot be called Christians, no matter what they call themselves, because they do not consider Christ to be God. Jehovah's Witnesses are undoubtedly a totalitarian sect, because Jehovah's Witnesses are a commercial cult.
For instance, in mid-2009, Dworkin gave an interview to the federal Russian channel NTV, where among other harsh statements, he compared Jehovah's Witnesses to drug dealers and called them slaves.
In fact, what they give for free is similar to how a drug dealer in an alley gives the first shot for free. And he might even give the second shot for free. But to get the third shot, people run to him and bring money. This is done by people for free, who live in Bethels and work irregular hours in exchange for a bed in a dormitory and meals in a common dining hall. Food comes from Jehovah's Witnesses farms. Similar slaves produce the food there. In other words, the expenses are minimal.
This interview, which was clearly propagandistic, contributed to a surge of hatred and aggression against Jehovah's Witnesses and caused a drastic increase in religiously motivated crimes in Russia, including attacks on prayer houses and private homes of believers, as well as threats and brutal physical violence. Here's a far from complete list of acts of violence against Jehovah's Witnesses, committed by Russian citizens in 2009-2010 following Dworkin's speeches. An attack was carried out on the home of an elderly Jehovah's Witness couple, with their windows being shattered by stones. A schoolboy whose parents are Jehovah's Witnesses was attacked. 2 female Jehovah's Witnesses were assaulted, with one being struck on the head and losing consciousness. 2 female Jehovah's Witnesses were brutally insulted and severely beaten. 2 female Jehovah's Witnesses were attacked, one being pushed down a flight of stairs and the other kicked in the back. An attack on a Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses resulted in the beating of the security guards and the building being set on fire.
The Jehovah's Witnesses cult doesn't hold up because of their ridiculous, absurd, self-contradictory faith. It holds up through the strict control of the cult. It's a very strict totalitarian sect and cult. Pedophilia. There are actually hundreds of cases of pedophilia, and the cult has covered them up every time.
Cults, 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 cults.
Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult.
Hands off our children. Belgorod is a cult-free territory.
And this is just a small part of the consequences of merely 1 year of public activity by just one representative of the anti-cult movement in one country. Dworkin's public, extremist, and baseless statements led to a series of attacks and acts of violence against Jehovah's Witnesses and other religious groups in various regions of Russia in 2009-2010. Numerous cases have also been recorded where large families of Jehovah's Witnesses were harmed in various ways, had their property damaged, and had their homes burned to the ground. All of this was done by individuals influenced by Dworkin's manipulative speeches, which carry a hidden message of denying human rights of stigmatized groups of people and turning them into public targets.
That's right. Persecuted. You must be persecuted. Because it's just a nightmare. It's a cult.
Why put people in prison? You have your truth. We have our truth. But there are more of us than you. If they cross the red line, not only the line,
red line?
in the past,
Well,
these were
religion.
stoned to death.
Again, raising the issue of destructiveness, totalitarian sects may be compared to a circle of scorched earth that constantly expands, leaving only scorched earth and ruins inside. Such spiritual casualties, crippled individual, remain outside. They are cast out and then thrown back into society, for society itself to somehow rehabilitate them and deal with their problems.
Let's consider an example of using a manipulative method aimed at forming an image of the enemy and dehumanizing certain groups of people. Please note that in his public speeches, Alexander Dworkin regularly repeats the following stigmatizing comparison.
Another name for totalitarian sects is destructive cults. Destructive meaning ruinous, like cancerous cells that enter the body and spread metastases throughout the organism until the body dies. Cults behave in society like a cancerous tumor in one's body, draining nutrients from society and feeding off it until the body itself dies. Just as a cancerous tumor destroys the body, a cult similarly destroys society from within.
Dworkin's use of such metaphors as scorched earth and cancerous tumor in relation to people who are labeled sectarians or cultists is not accidental. Dworkin deliberately voices these vivid negative figurative comparisons in order to bypass your critical thinking and dehumanize representatives of those communities in your eyes, intentionally associating them with something extremely dangerous and harmful, something that requires immediate elimination. Such a comparison activates the mechanisms of black and white thinking in your mind when an object that a manipulative narrative is focused on is regarded as an absolute evil requiring unconditional rejection. At the same time, Dworkin himself is perfectly aware that his radical rhetoric is a blatant violation of human rights and a manifestation of extremism. So, in order to avoid direct accusations of inciting aggression towards people, from lecture to lecture he plays safe by voicing another manipulative statement: "We don't fight cultists, we fight cults."
We are often asked a standard journalistic question: tell us, how do you fight cultists? And I always have the same answer to that. I don't fight cultists, I fight cults.
The phrase "we fight cults" and not cultists, often used by Dworkin and his followers, is a prime example of semantic manipulation. This statement contains a dichotomy that creates an illusion of differentiation between the concept of a cult as an organization and the real people who are its members. However, in reality, such a differentiation is impossible since any organization consists of people and cannot exist without them. Dworkin's manipulative statement ignores the fact that the activities of the organizations he called cults and the personalities of the so-called cultists are inextricably linked. This means that he calls people cancerous tumors and scorched earth, thereby causing public hatred towards them. To make the essence of this manipulation clearer to you, Please answer the following question. When you heard this comparative metaphor that cults are cancerous tumors, what image appeared in your mind? Some kind of abstract image of a cult? Or did you see an image of specific personalities whom you associate with the word cult, whom you yourself know or saw in the media? Your consciousness actually displayed an image of people because the image and mental command that Dvorkin instilled through such verbal manipulations consists in the following message: cultists are dangerous. They must be exterminated. Such manipulative techniques used by representatives of the anti-cult clique provoke cognitive dissonance in your mind, forcing you to accept negative images without critical assessment of those. This provocation of cognitive dissonance is a form of mental violence, inasmuch as it undermines independence of a person's thinking, forcibly instills hatred in him towards his fellow citizens, and gives him a direct instruction for violent actions. Please note that anti-cultists use this technique of covert cultivation of hatred to your detriment in many spheres of life, when they need to make you hate those people whom they target, when they need to set one part of society against another, causing a wave of hatred and violence within society.
Manipulative methods used by Alexander Dvorkin constitute illegal actions that have already caused severe psychological, moral, and physical suffering among the population and have led to many deaths, details of which will be discussed later. Dvorkin's public statements bear clear signs of incitement to hatred and meet all the criteria of the threshold test established under the Rabat Plan of Action. According to widely recognized international legal norms, such activities should be prohibited by law, and all individuals involved in their execution should be held accountable in accordance with the law.
Interestingly, Alexander Dvorkin, the leader of anti-cult organizations and the author of the term totalitarian sect, opposes the introduction of a legal definition for cult. This is because it would then be necessary to prove, based on facts, that an organization is indeed a totalitarian sect or destructive cult, and that the accusations against it have a factual basis. As the leader of the anti-cult movement in Russia himself stated, most of these cases would be lost.
22 years ago, I started dealing with cults. I used to say that we urgently needed to introduce a legal term cult to address this issue. However, soon I realized that it is absolutely impossible to do it now, in the current situation. Because if we were to introduce the legal term cult tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, courts would be flooded with lawsuits from those very cults that would be saying, prove that we are a cult, and present all the evidence to support such a definition. Prove that we comply with this definition. Thus, a large portion of lawsuits would likely be lost. Then, by court decision, we would no longer be able to call various organizations cults, even the most sinister and disgusting ones.
Definition of the terms sect and cult in the law would automatically restrict their unjustified use, which in turn would deprive anti-cultists of their main tool that represents a starting point for subsequent illegal actions.
Now, we at least don't have such a legal term, therefore we can call cults cults. And I personally withstood 5 legal proceedings. In fact, any person can call an organization cult with no fear of punishment if he considers it to be a cult, and there is nothing that can be done. This is what I'm expressing. It's a religious science term, it's a theological term. I'm expressing my opinion, and they won't be able to do anything about it.
It is worth remembering that using the term sect or cult in an accusatory or demonizing way is a direct violation of the constitutional rights of citizens in a democratic society, in particular, freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. Through such actions, anti-cultists, who decided that they are entitled to pass such a sentence on any individual or group of people, basically seek to supersede law enforcement agencies and the law.
At a time when anti-cult terrorists carry out their destructive activities in various countries, introducing the mindsets they need among masses of people, the number of hate crimes against religions and beliefs is growing proportionally. A huge number of people across the world who became targets of purposeful persecution have been facing abuse, physical violence, and forced isolation for many years and decades. They experience mental violence, moral oppression, fear, and humiliation.
When someone tries to label you as a cultist, it's extremely dangerous. Essentially, such a label in society marks you as a target that can and should be destroyed. This is similar to how the Nazis once forced Jews to wear yellow stars. This mark created a chasm between Jews and the rest of the population, highlighting their difference, marking them as others and non-humans, and making them easy targets for aggression on the part of people influenced by propaganda. The yellow star signaled that its wearers could be treated as less than human. Using the yellow star was one of many ways the Nazis dehumanized Jews and prepared the ground for their mass extermination. Ultimately, this labeling led to one of the most tragic chapters in human history, the Holocaust. Today, anti-cultists use the same methods, assigning labels like cult and sect to various organizations, thereby separating them from society and stripping them of their status as people. These labels take away their democratic rights and freedoms, telling society that these people are different and that they can be deprived of their rights, treated without respect, and even with violence. During the Nazi era, the harsh treatment of Jews was the result of well-organized propaganda. The media of that time were tools for creating the image of the enemy, despite the lack of facts and evidence. Similarly, today, innocent people labeled as cult or sect members by anti-cultists become victims of accusations for crimes they did not commit.
Because a cultist, a member of a totalitarian sect, if required to lie, steal, kill, and so on, he simply doesn't think twice but follows the order. Because he would act, for the benefit of the whole world, for the salvation of humanity and so on. What does some insignificant human life matter that gets in the way of this? Undoubtedly, for this, any means are justified.
But that's more of a fanatic than a cultist.
Any cultist is actually a fanatic by definition.
You use the term war, saying we need a war. I mean, these are different kinds of people. Doesn't it bother you? This is just an emotional question.
Well, it's a fight. It's a war. Call it what you wish, but it really is.
It doesn't bother me.
It's a war against inhuman organizations that enslave people and deprive them of freedom.
Stigmatizing certain groups and communities by defining them as cult, totalitarian sect, or destructive cult shapes public perception of them as highly negative and dangerous entities. This leads to the marginalization of these communities as social groups and their discrimination within society. They are met with suspicion, insulted, humiliated, and ridiculed. People refuse to hire them, collaborate with them, or engage in personal relationships with them. The problems these individuals face are numerous, from public condemnation, conflicts, and threats to physical violence, criminal prosecution, searches, and more. Stigmatized individuals become targets. They are hated, despised, and avoided. They are met with anger and disgust. They can face anything, from disdainful avoidance to violence, including murder. And this happens solely because anti-cultists chose them as targets. Constant demonization and hate speech undoubtedly have a severe negative impact on the physical and psychological health of the victim. This topic has been extensively researched by psychologists and psychiatrists. A report published by the American Psychological Association compares the symptoms observed in victims of hate crimes to those of post-traumatic stress disorder. A study conducted in the United States in 2001 showed that victims of hate crimes experience more severe consequences than victims of other types of crimes. Victims of prejudice, members of stigmatized groups, often experience depression, which may include sadness, fatigue, anhedonia, hopelessness, social withdrawal, or even catatonia. Victims of prejudice also experience stigma, a state of personal shame and devaluation, which is a crucial component of depression. They experience an increased number of suicidal thoughts and other mental health issues. For victims of prejudice, suicide offers an escape from the hatred they face, driven by despair and a desire to flee. Suicidal victims of prejudice do not wish to harm themselves. They simply want to avoid the harm inflicted upon them by others. A classic example of creators of stereotypes and enforcers of prejudices are the Nazis.
Branded and socially isolated, the victims of anti-cultists feel much like the victims of the Holocaust once did. The fact is, the targets of anti-cultist terrorism, whether an organization or an individual subjected to persecution and attacks, feel doomed and eventually come to terms with their situation. This is comparable to how Holocaust victims resign themselves to their fate, knowing they were inevitably facing execution or the gas chamber. The hopelessness and fear of the inevitable traumatize a person on a subconscious level. Even though the conscious mind tries to suppress and push away this fear, the subconscious trauma remains deeply rooted. Imagine what these people experience and how their lives unfold after enduring such trauma. So, the labels of sect or cult used by anti-cultists are not just words. They are tools that lead to the destruction of the foundations of humanity. The history of Nazism's impact on the world teaches us that when society starts to divide people into us and them, it leads to irreparable consequences.
One of your statements. Orthodox Christians are no better than everyone else. If they were, the whole world would have become Orthodox a long time ago. Maybe we are even worse than everyone else. But Orthodoxy is definitely the only direct path to God. What gives you the right to state that? And I think it's a statement, first of all. Secondly, isn't this inciting, at any rate to some degree, of interreligious hostility or intolerance?
Well, no, not at all. Because first of all, every religion considers itself true while all others are mistaken. A member of any religion can say this. The path of Indian asceticism is only to attain eternal death, to attain eternal non-being. And in this, of course, lies the demonic nature of Hinduism. When you see two women in the street brainwashing a mother with a stroller, you can approach her and say, don't listen to them. They are cultists, Jehovah's Witnesses. They grossly distort the Holy Scripture.
Isn't this inciting, at any rate to some degree, of interreligious hostility or intolerance?
Well, no, not at all. Muhammad, although he belonged to that powerful tribe, he was from its poor branch. So he was a rather poor man. He got a job with his distant relative, the twice-widowed Khadijah, and started leading her caravans, gaining her trust. And when he was 25 years old, Khadijah, who was then over 40, married for the third time her pretty-faced clerk. Inciting interreligious hostility is if I insult specific bearers of one or another particular religious idea. The principle of Orthodox Christian relations with other religions is respect for every person. Long before he arrived, all of Moscow was covered with posters of this man with a horse-like face, and it was inscribed that the great Tony Robbins had arrived, and everyone was wondering what this was all about. Then Muhammad had some strange visions and revelations. Some people believe he had epileptic seizures. Tom Cruise is the Goebbels of Scientology, the minister of propaganda. Thorov himself is a very gray and dark man. He speaks very boringly. He is sort of like a very dull, gray person, and respect for every person. Who do we know? What cultists do we know? Street beggars? Annoying recruiters who knock on our doors? Cults are dangerous at the societal level because, unlike traditional denominations that enrich society and create culture, cults give nothing to society. We don't know cultists who are respect for every person. Writers, artists, music composers, philosophers, and so on, they only drain society of its vital resources, just like a cancerous tumor pulls the vital resources from the body until it eventually destroys it.
The cancerous tumor pulls the vital resources from the body until it eventually destroys it.
We can discuss each of the cults, many of them, talking about how exactly these totalitarian schemes are embodied in their teachings. The International Society for Krishna Consciousness, or the Hare Krishnas, This cult had a lot they would like to conceal. There was drug trafficking, arms trade, and murders. Overall, it is quite obvious that the International Society for Krishna Consciousness is a ruthless group aiming to seize power. It is built on strict totalitarian principles and dreams of spreading those principles to the entire global population. It seems clear that this is one of the attempts of the impending Antichrist. It is obvious. Perhaps the International Society for Krishna Consciousness is one of the actual forerunners of the Antichrist, who ultimately seeks to seize power worldwide. Possibly, it is through these very methods that his advent is being prepared. There can be no equality between Orthodox Christianity, which has existed in Russia for 1,000 years, and a tiny marginal cult like the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which appeared here just a couple of decades ago, but loudly demands to be recognized on a par with orthodoxy and given preferential treatment.
There was an attack on the temple of the Moscow Society.
In Barnaul, there was an attempted attack on Krishna worshippers.
Krishna worshippers were beaten in Moscow.
Krishna devotee was beaten.
Scientology is one of the most dangerous totalitarian sects, and Scientology surpasses many cults in its destructiveness. I've seen many ex-Scientologists who are absolutely just severely mentally ill. I'll repeat again, cults are very aggressive and very deceitful. With the mentality of a slave and the mentality of a whistleblower. He works for intelligence services. He's been gathering information since he was a child. I mean, he brings money, he brings information. If you're in Scientology, when you finally run out of everything, when you run out of money and your mental health or physical health, they will get rid of you. They will throw you out on the street and forget about you.
FSB released video of searches at Scientology centers.
Searches in Moscow in connection with the case of Scientology.
Court sentenced 5 Scientologists.
Scientology organizations have been declared undesirable.
Among neo-Pentecostals, there is a tithe, but again, no one counts it. Yet, there is such an ordinary elementary principle of extortion. It's an alternative version of Christianity created by the enemy of the human race, which is called Christianity, and from which the entire essence of Christianity has been hollowed out. Neo-Pentecostals are 300,000 plus activists who will go where they are told and do what they are ordered to do. This is not a figure of speech.
Attack on the Pentecostal
Oman attacked Pentecostals. Searches conducted at the homes of leaders of the new generation
disrupted a Pentecostal worship service.
Charge. Thus, public activities of the ringleader of the Russian anti-cult clique, Alexander Dvorkin, exhibit signs of crimes associated with terrorist activities. Hostile statements that create an atmosphere of intolerance, resulting in verbal abuse, threats, and physical attacks on people, as well as attacks on buildings, including arson. This is incitement to commit terrorist acts that spread hatred and endanger lives. It also hinders the enjoyment of human rights, including the right to life, liberty, and security. Therefore, according to the definition in the UN General Assembly resolution adopted on June 22, 2023, this activity constitutes terrorism.
An aggravating circumstance is Dvorkin's deliberate use of special hidden manipulative methods and technologies aimed at covert influence, programming, and control of human behavior. Their use is directly evidenced by the fact that his public activities provoked a wave of violence among the population towards stigmatized victims, including physical violence against them, up to murders. These manipulative technologies operate bypassing critical perception through consciousness and directly affecting a person's deep subconsciousness. It is exactly the destructive mindsets and commands implanted into people's subconsciousness without their knowledge that force people to subsequently commit acts of violence and hatred against targeted individuals, chosen not by themselves, but by Dvorkin. He has artificially incited a wave of hatred and negativity in people and forced them to act, in a literal sense, Dvorkin has directed those individuals, like torpedoes, against their will and desire towards his chosen targets. Therefore, all those individuals who committed acts of aggression against other people who are just like them, but marked by anti-cultists with a yellow star, are also victims of informational terror attacks. Dvorkin had programmed them for those actions in advance at the level of subconsciousness. When he used manipulative technologies in his speeches, they were literally forced to act this way. And unknowingly, by attacking innocent people, they were enacting someone else's malicious will. This is why Dvorkin's speeches had such a powerful effect on people, although in the overwhelming majority of cases, evidence for his accusatory speeches was not presented. The mere utterance of these labels was enough to provoke an explosive reaction in society and a wave of brutality against the labeled groups.
The use of these hidden manipulative technologies within the anti-cult movement was first introduced by Alexander Dvorkin. This has since become a common practice for creating informational terror attacks by all anti-cult organizations, including Ratsers and Fekris. These very methods enable anti-cults to influence people against their will. Moreover, it doesn't matter if this happens directly through personal contact or remotely through media messages. The power of influence remains unchanged. More details about the technology itself, as well as about the source where Dvorkin received it from, will be provided a little later.
Representatives of anti-cult organizations use foul techniques of manipulative psychological influence on the masses to carry out real acts of terrorism. Until recently, it was believed that informational and psychological terror attacks were not as frightening as physical ones because they supposedly did not kill anyone directly like a bomb explosion would. But in reality, informational terror attacks are much more dangerous and destructive, most of all because they are conducted covertly, operating at the subconscious level, easily penetrating the critical thinking barrier of the conscious mind and infecting people with destructive beliefs, thereby creating new terrorists. The impact radius of such attacks is much larger than physical ones because by acting through the informational space, they are not limited by space or time. The most terrifying aspect of this situation is that for a very long time, up to today, a vast number of real terrorists have remained unpunished. However, while their methods of influencing the depths of the subconscious can go unnoticed by the masses, the demonization and groundless accusations of groups of people stigmatized by representatives of anti-cult organizations and systematic violation of the presumption of innocence are always in full sight. Even by this one factor alone, they can now be easily identified and held accountable to the fullest extent of the law for their complicity in and perpetration of terrorism.
Anti-cultists' influence on law enforcement agencies.
Public activities of anti-cultists are merely a preparatory stage for further involving law enforcement and security forces in suppressing religious groups. For this purpose, under the guise of educational work, members of anti-cult organizations deliver lectures and arrange consultations for law enforcement agencies, including police academies and security management, where they continue to propagate the same messages that cult members are a threat to society.
Anti-cultist Alexander Dvorkin gave a lesson to students in Chelyabinsk.
Cults lure people in through deception, withholding information, and dishonest advertising. Cults are dangerous to individuals because they enslave personality and turn a human into an obedient tool in the hands of cult leaders.
Such activities are not only unacceptable, but also dangerous, as they aim to instill radical ideology in the minds of security officials, which can have far-reaching consequences for society and the state as a whole.
Several eyewitness stories will help illustrate the seriousness of the problem and serve as examples of what terrorist anti-cult propaganda is capable of in the modern, civilized 21st century. First-person account from Andrei in Belgorod. Requested anonymity.
there were actions taken against us. For example, in the fall of 2012, we held a Congress. The area was cordoned off by Cossacks with whips. They beat drums, invited the NTV television company and local media, and portrayed our activities in a negative light. They shouted at us, "We'll throw a grenade at you," and the police did not react at all. At some of the actions against Jehovah's Witnesses, they wore T-shirts that said, "I hate Jehovah's Witnesses." I was directly threatened. "Aren't you afraid you'll get hit on the head and be disabled for life?" Given what I've witnessed since around 2010, I believe it will only worsen.
My dear ones, please, if you carry your faith, carry it with peace and kindness. We've never stabbed anyone, and we're not going to stab anyone.
In 2014, an elderly fellow believer was killed in Stary Oskol. She was on her way to a meeting, got into an elevator, and was found with multiple stab wounds, and her eyes gouged out. The local media wrote that she was a member of one of the cults, which is how they often refer to us. The perpetrators were never found. Our sister was beaten in her own apartment building by a man who then dragged her around the building. Funeral wreaths with inscriptions to victims of the Watchtower were placed at our Kingdom Hall in Belgorod, and swastikas were painted on the building's walls. I believe that the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses is orchestrated by the FSB. In their view, Jehovah's Witnesses do not fit into the political framework of today's Russia. The 5th Directorate of the KGB used to persecute dissenters. Today, it is the Directorate for the Protection of the Constitutional Order of the FSB. This is the political police. Jehovah's Witnesses refuse military service and do not support any political forces, which does not align with the ideology of modern Russia. I think the Russian Orthodox Church, ROC, plays the role assigned to it by the FSB. If we look at the history of the ROC as it exists today, it was created by Stalin's order in 1943. Since then, this religious organization has been a structural subdivision of the State Security Committee, which is now the FSB of Russia. Experienced police officers have told me that they don't understand why they are being forced to persecute people for their religion. One even said that under the current government, it has become embarrassing to work in the police force because they are detaining elderly women for talking about the Bible, apprehending people on the street for unclear reasons, breaking into apartments, and so on. What is happening to Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia today can happen to anyone, to any political or religious movement, such as Baptists, Pentecostals, or the autonomous Russian Orthodox Church. They are already under pressure and are at risk. The broad definitions of anti-extremist laws allow for the persecution of anyone. We know that people can be imprisoned for reposting something on the internet or for making a simple statement deemed extremist, using the law to force this into the so-called legal framework.
In 2017, due to lobbying by Dvorkin and members of his group, Jehovah's Witnesses were declared an extremist organization, and their activities were banned in Russia. From that moment, the repression against them intensified and continues to this day. Members of this religious organization face arrests, searches, and prosecutions, as well as cruel treatment and even torture. Some of them, including elderly people and retirees, have been sentenced to long terms in penal colonies and imprisonment for their beliefs and religious activities.
The editorial collegium of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation has determined the decision of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation dated April 20th, 2017 remains unchanged, and the appellate complaint of the Religious Organization Administrative Center of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia is dismissed.
Freedom of conscience in Russia has been crucified. There is no doubt that what happened to Jehovah's Witnesses will affect other denominations as well. A little bit later, religious persecutions will begin in Russia. There will be prisoners of conscience. The very term cult is certainly used as a stigma, as a label intended to turn people away from Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as from other organizations that are also labeled as cults by anti-cult activists or other opponents. If we assess the contribution of the anti-cult movement to the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses, I believe it plays an overwhelmingly negative role and largely contributes to the expansion of persecutions against peaceful believers who simply seek to satisfy their religious needs, guaranteed by the Constitution of the Russian Federation. the right to satisfy their religious needs, including the right to collectively profess their religion. Believers are already facing persecution, attacks, and physical violence in places where meetings and gatherings used to take place. They are subjected to acts of vandalism. We fear that this will become widespread. People who are guilty of nothing other than adhering to certain religious beliefs will find themselves targeted by those who consider them enemies of society.
As for liquidation of the Jehovah's Witnesses organization, in this regard, I have no disagreement with it. The ban on the organization is undoubtedly helpful. Primarily, we no longer see Jehovah's Witnesses in the streets, and consequently, people are protected from their intrusive propaganda and recruitment. When we talk about Jehovah's Witnesses, I certainly hope that their ordinary members will at least receive administrative penalties, but I understand that I'm not a lawyer and the law is the law.
They poured water on my hands and started hitting them with a taser. At that moment, it was the most painful sensation. I was electrocuted, just like other people were. They hit me on the head. They hit me in the ribs, on the right side of my body. They put a blue plastic bag over my head, tightened it, and I began to suffocate. At the moment when I began to suffocate, they put a hand over my mouth and put a taser on my buttocks in the crotch area. I think, apparently, it was a taser, and they started an electric current. When I was interrogated, apparently someone was brought into the adjacent room again, so I heard everything clearly. There were electric shocks and screams. Some names, surnames, and addresses. I said I would only cooperate with the investigator in the presence of my lawyer. Then they put a hat on my face and took me out into the woods behind the stadium.